4,000 years ago, the world's population started to increase. This happened as people left their nomadic lives and settled in agricultural communities. Natural disasters and disease kept growth down. But as cities and towns developed, the population rose more rapidly. With more secure food supplies and improved medical care, the 18th century saw the population boom. In 1800, around 800 million people lived on the planet. By 2000, the population is expected to reach almost 6 billion. Every second, 3 people are added to the world's population. In 10 seconds, this equals the size of your class. At this rate, the world's population could double over the next 50 years. So why is the population growing? How is it changing? And what does all this mean for the future? When you're trying to visualize populations, it's easy to imagine a group of 10 people, even 100. But when you multiply this by 10, 1,000 people are hard to make out, as are 10,000, 100,000. And by the time you reach 1 million, you completely lose sight of what you started with. So to make things easy, we're going to use this red chip to represent 1 million people. Canada's current population is 30 million. This may seem a lot, but not when you compare it to the total world population, which is over 5.5 billion. This population is distributed unevenly. Main density areas are East Asia, South Asia, Europe, and Northeastern America. The world's population is growing at an annual rate of 1.5%. But the majority of this growth is happening in less developed regions, where 80% of people live. Growth is slowing because of the decline in the average number of births per woman, or fertility rate. In 1977, the total fertility rate was 4. In 1997, it's 2.8. Over time, this decline will result in a higher proportion of older people in the population. So the world's population is changing. Let's take a look at how and why. On a global scale, the population changes as a result of the difference between births and deaths. A total fertility rate of 2.1 is required for a population to replace itself. But fertility rates vary from country to country. Many factors influence fertility rates, like wealth, education of women, cultural and religious beliefs, and access to contraception. India is a clear example of this. One out of every 6 people in the world lives in India. Its current population is 945 million. The Indian population is a diverse mix of religions and ethnic backgrounds. The majority of people are Hindus and Muslims, and a 4-tiered caste system separates different classes. The average birth rate is 3.6 children. However, fertility rates vary around the country.
India is a vast country, is a country of disparities. You have so much of variety in the country. You have different races, different languages, different religion, different tribes. You expect in such a vast country different varieties. In terms of fertility, we can have a demographic division of north and south, where the fertility rates differ quite markedly.
In poor northern states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, the total fertility rate is around 6 births per female. In the wealthier southern states like Kerala, it's 2.
The main factor responsible for that, I think, is the education, and particularly the education of female.
In India, the total female literacy rate is 39%. In Kerala, it's 81%. Education impacts on fertility rates by delaying marriage, meaning women have children later. Educated women are also more health conscious and usually marry into wealthy families who can afford medical care. This lowers infant mortality, and when more kids survive, people have smaller families.
Education raises the status of women and it brings about modernization, and the women is more ready to accept to the family planning programs.
In northern India, literacy rates, particularly those of females, are very low. Therefore, all the factors discouraging growth in the south encourage growth in the north.
Education is low and status of women is also low. Even if she doesn't want to have more children, she has no say in reproductive behavior.
The social reality of life in India also means that sons are often preferred over daughters. Traditionally, sons carry the family name and are relied on to look after their parents in their old age. Dowries must be produced for daughters when they get married, so girls are sometimes regarded as a financial liability because they make an economic contribution to their husband's family, not their own.
Two-son theory, they want at least to have 2 survival sons. So it means if they don't have the desired composition of family, they keep on producing.
But things are slowly changing. India has a formal population policy. Abortion has been legalized. And the legal age to marry has been raised to encourage greater education, particularly of females. On a regional scale, population change also results from migration. This includes both internal and external migration. Migration can be voluntary, where people choose to move from one place to another. Families and couples immigrate to stay together. Others move countries for a change of lifestyle or culture. People can also move for economic reasons, like moving to a wealthier country in search of better living conditions, or moving from the country to the city for work. At other times, migration is involuntary, like people fleeing war or famine. In Central Africa, this kind of mass migration has caused significant population change. Rwanda is a small mountainous country. There is no form of census, but estimates put the population at around 8 million people. The population is divided into 2 main tribal groups. The majority Hutu, who make up 90% of the population, and the minority Tutsi, who make up the rest. In 1994, civil war erupted between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and millions of people fled the violence to neighboring countries. Pat Burgess is an aid worker who went to Rwanda as part of the international community's response to the war.
So when I first went there in 1994, the entire country was deserted. The majority of the population, the Hutus, a large percentage of them had run out of the country. So you had, a third to a half of the population gone, and the farms were deserted, the towns were deserted. Well, 2 million of them fled, just ran in terror over the borders into Tanzania and Zaire. And that was where the international community was faced with millions of people, literally, with nowhere to go, no food, no clothing, no shelter, and no medicaments.
Refugee camps housing up to 250,000 people were established along the Rwandan borders.
The refugees would make these tiny hovels out of grass and sticks, and we would then distribute plastic to them, plastic sheeting, which they would put over the top of this little hovel. And that was wet season. It was raining every day. There was mud everywhere. Yeah, health problems were a terrible issue in the camps. When we first arrived, there was an outbreak of cholera. There were tens and tens of thousands of people who died from cholera when we were first there. Also severe diarrhoea. Malaria was very, very bad in the wet season. That was in addition to those who had been killed in the genocide, and they initially were coming down. The rivers and the lake were full of bodies when we first arrived there. The international community had to give out food, and there were hundreds of thousands of people at these gathering points fighting, starving people fighting for food. Initially, people were killed every day at the distribution points for the food. We came across a large group of children who were orphans, whose parents had been lost or killed, and we ended up with 1,300 kids to feed and house, and we had the problem of trying to find and cook enough food for 1,300 kids every night. And initially, we literally couldn't get enough firewood to cook the food fast enough to stop them dying.
The sudden concentration of people in one area caused many environmental problems. Rivers became highly polluted, so collecting water was a major difficulty. Water had to be shipped in, chlorinated, and then distributed. The local forests also suffered.
But the forest around it supports a huge number of animals, including the mountain gorillas who are around there, and chimpanzees and large snakes, and you can imagine 1 million people suddenly turning up in a small country village, needing firewood to cook, needing food to eat, and they had a significant effect on the environment. And after a number of months, the refugee camps became like little towns, really, in a way. There were little markets sprung up where they would sell home-brewed banana beer and beans and rice. You see the beginning of a sort of capitalist economy.
In 1997, the camps were forcibly broken up, and the refugees again had to move. The majority of refugees ran back to Rwanda, while others fled deep into the rainforest in Zaire.
Because there was a mass migration of people along the roads again, going home, basically. It was a harsh journey, but it was interesting in that some people did die, but a lot less died going back into Rwanda than had on the way out in 1994. One of the major problems was that their houses and their fields that they had left a couple of years before, others in that region, being a very poor region, had come, moved into their houses, moved onto their fields, grown their crops, fixed the houses, and suddenly the old tenants turned up again and said, well, here I am, I want my house back.
One of the main arguments for reducing population growth is the impact more people will have on the world's resources.
When I was born in 1932, there were 2 billion people on the planet. Now there's just about 6 billion people on the planet. That means in my lifetime, the human population has tripled. What we have seen is the most dramatic event in the last 65 million years, the explosive growth of the population of one species to a position of total dominance on the planet.
But there are different opinions as to how many people the planet can support. Paul Ehrlich is a professor of population studies and has been concerned about world population trends for many years.
There isn't a scientist in the world who doesn't think that resources put a limit on how much populations can grow. You cannot have an infinite population on a finite planet. We are wiping out the other organisms of the planet, for example, that are working parts of the systems that control our climate, that supply us with food, that supply us with fresh water, and so on. We're sawing off the limb that we're sitting on.
With advances in technology, other people see the possibility of using the same amount of resources more efficiently and therefore supporting more people.
I think there's no question that we've used an extraordinary amount of the easily available resources, but we've also shown an incredible ingenuity to swing to other resources that were once not thought about, not discovered, or not thought useful. So that I think the ingenuity is going to take us at least out for another century or two before what I think some doomsayers are suggesting.
But the impact of population growth is not just a factor of numbers of people.
The environmental impact of a population is basically the product of three things: the size of the population, how much each individual in the population consumes, that is per capita consumption, and what kinds of technologies and social arrangements you use to service that consumption.
If we shrank the world's population to a group of 100 people, it would look like this. There would be 57 Asians, 21 Europeans, 14 from the Americas, and 8 from Africa. 50% of the entire world's wealth would be in the hands of only 6 people, all of whom would be North Americans. 70 people would be unable to read. 50 would suffer from malnutrition. 80 would live in substandard housing, and only 1 would have a university education. It's clear we don't all have access to the same amount of resources. These kids live in Vietnam. Hannah starts her day by washing with water drawn from a well. Kids in her village only receive basic schooling as they're needed to work on family farms. Heath lives in Australia and starts each day with a blast of water from the shower. His house has flushing toilets and running water. Most kids in this country go to school for at least 10 years. In Vietnam, most people travel by foot or ride bicycles. Even in cities, cars are rare. In Australia, it's bicycles that are rare. When it comes to meal times, the difference in resource use is very clear. For dinner, this Vietnamese family cooks over a wood fire. Food is grown in the garden around the house. For this Australian family, dinner comes from nearby supermarkets. It's stored in a fridge and cooked on an electric stove. This food is grown far from the local region. Some is even imported from overseas. Resource limitation is really a question about what kind of lifestyles we want to live and how much we're willing to share resources around. This man is about to have a vasectomy, which is an operation carried out to prevent men from fathering more children. In China, these operations are offered free. They're part of the radical strategy the government has adopted in a bid to curb China's exploding population. China is home to over 1.2 billion people. That's a quarter of the world population. This population is growing at a rate of 1.4% per year, but with a fertility rate at replacement level, it is expected to stabilize by 2050. This is the result of the government's tough one-child policy, which has been in force since 1979. It aims to stabilize the population at 1.3 billion by 2000. The policy encourages couples to only have one child by providing benefits to those who comply and penalties for those who don't. Benefits include cash payments and preference in housing, education, and employment. Penalties include fines, declines in salary, higher medical costs, and even job loss. Contraception is provided free, as are abortions and vasectomies. Policy only strictly applies to those in urban areas. In the country where large families are often an economic necessity, couples are allowed to have a second child after a period of years, but definitely no more than 2. China's solution to population growth has been radical but effective, but it does raise some important moral issues. With a cultural and economic preference for sons, female infanticide and abandonment became more common. Fortunately, these practices are declining. With the drastic reduction in births, concerns have also been raised about the impact on the age structure of the population. As people limit their families, the proportion of the population aged over 65 is expected to grow from 66 million in 1990 to 167 million by 2020. With no social security network, these old people must rely on their families for support. Another issue is whether efforts to halt population growth should override individual rights to plan family size. Should governments be able to tell people how many children they can have? Since you started watching this video, the world's population has increased by 3,600 people. While efforts have been made to reduce population growth, numbers will still rise before the global population stabilizes. To meet the challenges population changes pose, we have to debate some big issues. How many people can the planet support? Will drastic falls in fertility rates mean we end up with an aging and vulnerable population? Is reducing our numbers the only way to ensure a sustainable future?